Thank you, Hans, and also to Sam Thomas and the User-Centered Energy Systems Technology Collaboration Program for this invitation to present today. The Energy Efficiency 2022, this year's market report. The report is free to download on the IEA website, and for the first time associated with the release, we've provided an energy efficiency data explorer, which is also free to use for those who wish to get behind some of the data that we used in the report in more detail. The market report was just released a few days ago and takes a look back at the past 12 months of developments in the energy efficiency landscape. It comes at a particularly pertinent time when we've seen the world's first truly global energy crisis, which has dramatically escalated concerns over energy security and the inflationary impact of higher fossil fuel energy prices. This has highlighted the critical role of energy efficiency. Our report is structured in three main sections, looking at the recent trends in energy efficiency and its role in addressing the current crisis. We also provide a special focus on the ASEAN countries. I'd now like to hand over to one of the report's lead authors, Emma Mooney, who will talk through some of the report's main findings. Over to you, Emma.
Thank you, Nick. It will be no surprise that this year's energy efficiency market report is framed by the current energy crisis. Energy price and supply chain pressures that were already brewing last year have been amplified by Russia's invasion of Ukraine and subsequent sanctions and disruption to energy and broader economic markets. Energy efficiency is now at the center of policy agendas as governments and citizens around the world urgently look to save energy, secure supply, and reduce energy bills. From the crisis arises the first message of our report, that we are seeing strong signs of governments turning to efficiency as it is the best way to simultaneously meet energy affordability, security, and climate change goals. Given this economic backdrop, it should be no surprise that global energy intensity improvements are expected to perform strongly in 2022, 2%. This is almost 4 times the rate achieved over the last 2 years. Energy intensity is the leading measure of energy efficiency at the economy-wide level and represents the total amount of energy needed to produce 1 unit of GDP. However, this year's results come after 5 years of improvements averaging at only around 1% per year, far off the track of the 4% annual global average needed over this decade to achieve global climate goals and align with the IEA net zero scenario. This brings us to the central question which we explore in this year's report. Is 2020 likely to be a turning point for energy efficiency? Something that we're tracking very closely is changes in energy demand, which are one of the main drivers of the energy intensity progress. In tracking the dynamics of energy demand over the last few years, we saw a contraction of around 4% in 2020 due to the initial impact of COVID restrictions and then followed by a rebound of just 5% in 2021. This compares with longer-term growth over the last decade of around 1.3 to 1.7%. In the building sector, energy consumption rose by 5 times more in 2021 than it fell in 2020 due to COVID. While space and water heating are the largest energy consumers in the building sector, space cooling is growing fastest, up at 6.5% in 2021 as more people gain access to air conditioners for the first time, particularly true in the ASEAN region. Transport energy demand has also recovered strongly, up 8% in 2021, but still not up to pre-COVID levels, as sectors such as aviation remained below pre-COVID levels. Industrial energy demand was least negatively impacted through the COVID crisis, holding steady in 2020 and experiencing one of its strongest years' growth in recent times in 2021. This brought around a shift in the makeup of energy demand towards more energy intensive industry over the last few years, and was one of the main explanations for the slower efficiency progress at the global level during the COVID pandemic. This year, we are tracking on a daily basis how energy demand is shifting in relation to the crisis. This year's initial data suggests a significant moderation in overall energy demand growth as consumers and markets are impacted by high energy prices and supply pressures. with growth dropping back from 5% last year to be closer to around 1% at the global level. Energy-related cost of living pressures are a major concern this year, driven by high fossil fuel prices. Increasing energy costs has been the single biggest contributor to inflation experienced this year in most countries, pushing up the cost of living for families worldwide and setting back progress on energy access in emerging and developing countries. Energy poverty is not only a financial issue facing people, but a health one, with individuals and families facing the prospect of having to cut back on energy consumption and comfort levels to meet household budgets. To address this emerging costs of living crisis, governments have allocated more than $550 billion in temporary support to help with affordability this year. In emerging markets and developing economies, the value of this temporary support now exceeds that provided for clean energy investments since 2020. Of course, the energy crisis is particularly more acute in countries with greater exposure to natural gas in their energy mix. Heating is one of the most important areas where energy efficiency can help in this regard, with natural gas the dominant fuel used for heating worldwide, representing about 40% of the residential heating demand globally. However, the exposure to gas in the heating mix varies widely among countries, with some almost independent from gas and for others, the majority of or almost all of their heating needs. Across the world, governments are moving fast to bring in measures to reduce this exposure, in particular in Europe, where countries representing around 80% of residential gas demand have plans to ban or phase out new gas and heating connections in the coming year. Efficiency measures are the best policy to reduce the impact of rising energy bills. Here we can see the annual residential bill for a typical building categorized by efficiency level. Those who live in the average home in the B or the C classes in the chart are more protected from rising prices, with bills around 40% lower than those for people who live in less efficient homes in the lower redder regions of the chart. For families in the least efficient homes, they can be paying up to 3 times more for the same level of comfort. Unfortunately, the evidence we've gathered suggests that it is those who are least able to afford energy who are most often exposed to poor quality or low efficiency housing, underscoring the importance of government retrofit and programs that target those facing energy poverty and live in poor quality housing conditions, such as the Energy Affordability Programme and the Greener Homes Initiative in Canada, which provides free home energy needs assessment and free energy saving kits for eligible households, and helps with other upgrades like more efficient heating. This example for a typical home is in the United Kingdom, but the same story is true in every country. A similar situation exists with transport energy costs, which typically represent around half the energy bill of most families and households around the world. New, more efficient cars can be around 40% cheaper to run than less efficient models in the same class, and electric vehicles can be typically around half the cost compared with their most efficient conventional equivalents. In addition to helping with affordability, energy efficiency plays a vital role in delivering energy security. What we can see in this chart are forces pushing the global energy demand higher through greater economic activity, such as higher incomes, rising population, business activity, as well as structural shifts towards or away from more energy-intensive activities. These are offset by the energy moderating forces of improved efficiency. On balance, the efficiency gains have halved the potential growth in the global energy demand over the last 6 years, taking vital pressure off the need for greater fossil fuel consumption and more power stations. In IEA countries alone, such efficiency actions taken over the last 20 years have reduced this year's energy bill by $680 billion US dollars. This is based on current energy prices. To put this in perspective, this represents around 15% of the total energy expenditure in IEA countries this year. Efficiency is also one of the largest measures to reduce global CO2 emissions. Since 2000, here in the chart, there has been upward pressure on CO2 emissions from rising populations and incomes, which have been moderated by improvements in energy intensity. In the most recent decade, so 2010, the effect of efficiency has been even greater, as the rate of energy intensity progress has almost doubled between the 2 decades. When combined with shifts in carbon intensity of the energy mix, the effect on lowering CO2 emissions has been even greater. The net effect of these changes means that efficiency gains of the last 20 years have halved the potential emissions growth from rising incomes population. With these efficiency improvements, CO2 emissions would have been, without these efficiency improvements, CO2 emissions would be around 30% higher today. An important positive trend we observed this year in 2022 has been the continued strong growth in energy efficiency related investment. This is expected to be up to 16% this year, rising to $560 billion. This year's result builds on last year's extremely strong performance of 25%, which was boosted by COVID recovery packages and rebounding economic activity, especially in the building sector. This year we saw a switch in the prime driver of efficiency related investment, transport investment, which was up 47%, driven by the rapid uptake of electric vehicles. They made up 1 in every 8 vehicles sold this year. Recent policy announcements such as the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States, the Repower Package in the EU, and the Green Transformation GX Plan in Japan are set to increase the overall level of energy efficiency investment even further, with levels expected to reach 1 trillion in the second half of this decade, as tracked by the IEA's announced policy scenario. However, these levels still need to be boosted by about 1/3 to be consistent with the levels needed in the IEA net zero scenario. One area where we have seen strong growth has been in electric heat pumps, particularly in Europe, where the number of units sold has increased by around 30% each year for the last 2 years. This has been driven by strong policy support in the form of incentive programs in many countries, helping address the issue of relatively higher upfront costs for heat pumps. Heat pumps are a key technology to reduce reliance on Russian gas in Europe, and as found in the IEA's special report on the topic released last week, achieving heat pump sales of 4 million units per year by 2025 can reduce EU annual gas consumption by 7 billion cubic meters a year, roughly equivalent to the amount of gas provided to Europe by the Trans-Adriatic pipeline last year. I'd now like to hand over to my colleague, Mia Cowarth.
Thanks, Emma. One of the key findings, other findings we highlight in this year's market report is the growing importance of energy efficiency in emerging and developing countries. This group constitutes around 60% of energy demand currently, and under current policies is set to rise to 65% by 2030. At the same time, an average person in an emerging market or developing economy uses around 3 times less energy in their home and 4 times less energy for transport than a typical person in a more advanced economy. This highlights what the key finding that looking to the future, some of the largest efficiency opportunities will be in this group of countries. This year, we wanted to put a special focus on a region of the world where we do a lot of work, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. This region is home to around 10% of global population and is developing fast, with its economy doubling in size over the last 2 decades, as the region moves towards being one of the largest single markets for goods and services in the world. With energy demand also growing quickly, reliance on fossil fuels very high, strong volatility and high prices for gas, coal and oil this year, we have seen strong pressure on public budgets in the region to help keep energy affordable and accessible. This compounds the challenges to improve air quality and lower CO2 emissions that the region is facing. In this context, there's a lot to be gained from improved energy efficiency, which Emma highlighted is the best way to simultaneously meet energy affordability, security, and climate goals. Here we see energy demand in the ASEAN region growing much faster than annual growth rates at the global level. Particularly industry and transport has been leading this growth, with a fall in buildings energy consumption, a result of a large shift away from the use of traditional biomass, which results in large avoided energy demand savings. However, rapidly rising electricity demand growth as countries modernize and more people gain access to clean cooking and energy services such as air conditioning for the first time. Access to clean cooking technologies has almost quadrupled during the last 2 decades, reaching 70% of the population, but more than 200 million people in the region, mostly in rural areas, are still being left behind. The economic costs of this in terms of health, gender inequality, and environmental issues, such as poor air quality and respiratory diseases linked to the lack of universal access to clean cooking, are valued at more than $280 billion per year US by the World Bank. Just in the last year, as a result of the crisis, the energy crisis, as well as the COVID-19 crisis, around 100 million more people globally may no longer be able to cook with clean fuels, and 70 million more people who had recently gained access to electricity may no longer be able to afford it. Space cooling is one of the fastest growing areas of energy demand globally, but particularly in this region, with electricity consumption expected to more than quadruple by 2040. What perhaps most people know, that cooling energy efficiency, that the life cycle costs of moving to more efficient cooling are lower in the long term. What most people might not realize is that the purchase price of more efficient air conditioning units is also less, meaning that people can have access to a more efficient air conditioner at a lower upfront cost than buying a less efficient unit. Policy action, more aggressive policy action on efficient air conditioners, fans, and building envelopes could reduce space cooling and energy use by over 1/3 by 2040. But energy efficiency by itself is unlikely to be enough. Here we see a typical load profile for a commercial building and at noon across the course of the day, and a large focus of work going forward on grid interactive buildings, smart charging, and EVs can show how this load curve can be better managed to both reduce energy demand and help manage the increased amount of renewable energy coming into the grid to help balance overall grid pressures and lowering peak energy demand during the day, providing both flexibility and efficiency services. Transport is one area which we're looking at closely in the region, where globally fuel efficiency standards are playing a key role in reducing oil requirements, which is particularly important for energy security in this region. However, so far, none of the ASEAN member states have adopted fuel economy or CO2 reduction standards for any mode of transport. 2- and 3-wheelers are particularly modes of transport that are particularly highly used in the ASEAN region and provide very good opportunities for electrification. Over the course of this year, the IEA has released 2 roadmaps looking at energy efficient space cooling in the ASEAN region, as well as construction of buildings, and outlined working with these governments packages, policy package approach to address these issues in terms of incentives, regulation, and information campaigns. This has also involved interactive online training, as well as making this training available online for people to participate in at their own pace. So returning to our key question of whether or not 2022 will see a sustained turning point in energy efficiency, there are certainly lots of grounds to be optimistic. We're seeing a massive mobilization of finance, particularly through COVID recovery and crisis recovery measures across the world. We're seeing many new national plans for climate with a very strong efficiency focus. And even in the last few months, we've seen a large number of behavior and awareness campaigns launched by governments around the world for obvious reasons, not least here in Europe, encouraging citizens on how they can reduce energy costs as well as their energy usage. We're also seeing some interesting developments in the use of digital technologies to make grids smarter, to make better use of renewable and make better use of renewable resources which are coming online, as well as some very strong progress on key technologies such as heat pumps and electric vehicles. And then we were seeing significant policy developments globally, such as relating to cooling, energy efficiency, with new policies implemented or under development in some regions with the fastest growing electricity demand, and building codes introduced for the first time in many countries that didn't have them, while existing codes are being strengthened. Within IEA countries alone, the energy efficiency measures made since 2000 have saved consumers in these countries around $680 billion this year. And I think this is a very strong number, particularly in the context of the amount of support, temporary support that is being given, which is of the similar order of magnitude, that comes at a much higher cost to public budgets. So in conclusion, will 2022 see a turning point for energy efficiency progress? Well, here at the IEA, we're tracking the data very closely. There are many hopeful signs through this new policy focus, but also challenges remain. As we've seen in the past, over the last few years, energy efficiency progress has slowed globally. And so there's large scope for this year, bringing about a major turning point, but this will require sustained policy action, and particularly as hopefully the energy crisis and prices fall, that this action is sustained for the longer term. One of the areas where there's been a lot of interest was at the recent IEA Annual Global Conference on Energy Efficiency, which saw one of the largest gatherings of high-level government ministers gathered to specifically talk about energy efficiency, seeing an unprecedented level of interest and action, where a joint statement, the Sonderberg Action Plan, was issued calling on all governments, industry, enterprises, and stakeholders to strengthen their action on energy efficiency. This year, the annual conference will be held here in Paris on the 6th to 8th of June, and will be another key moment for gathering the energy efficiency community and strengthening policies in the context of the ongoing crisis. With this, I'd like to thank once again the users TCP for this opportunity to present, and hand over for any questions and answers and further discussion. Thank you.